At the moment, members of NATO are currently involved with trying to stop Russia from invading Ukraine. According to the latest news reports, there are currently 130,000 Russian troops along the Russian side of the Russia-Ukraine border, but this may have gone up since this video has gone out. The US, the UK and other Western countries have advised their citizens to leave Ukraine. Apparently invasion could happen as early as Wednesday, although some were expecting Putin to wait until after the Winter Olympics in China finished on 20th February. My name is Pravin Jaraj, and I'm going to briefly explain what is happening with Russia and Ukraine. Why would Russia want to invade Ukraine? In a nutshell, it's all about influence. Ukraine is one of several independent countries that used to be part of the Russian Empire, and then the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. A number of other countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, have since opted to join NATO and the EU. So have many Eastern European countries such as East Germany, Poland, Hungary and Romania that were members of the Warsaw Pact, the defensive organisation that opposed NATO during the Cold War. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, was a defensive organisation that was set up to protect the countries in Western Europe and the US during the Cold War. Putin believes that since the Soviet Union has collapsed, the NATO has encroached on its own territory and its own sphere of influence. He wants to draw the line with Ukraine and wants NATO to promise that it won't let Ukraine join. But the reason why other former Soviet and Eastern European countries chose to join NATO in the first place is because they wanted definitive protection from Russia, who they feared would invade at any time. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty states that if one member of NATO is attacked, every other member of NATO will consider it an attack against each of all of them. So if Russia attacked, say, Lithuania or Poland, then all of the other members would act in its defence in some form. There was an attempt by pro-Western government in Ukraine to try to join NATO, but this was opposed by the opposition. Ironically, the only time Article 5 has ever been invoked was in September 2001, when the US was attacked by Osama bin Laden. If Putin doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO, then he needs to show that Russia is not a threat to Ukraine. Unfortunately, his actions have shown the opposite. This isn't a new conflict that's suddenly emerged this year. In 2012, Ukraine tried to initiate an association agreement with the EU. This would not have been a full membership, but it was usually the first stage of the process that eventually would have ended up in membership. Ukraine had its own issues which it had to sort out before EU member states would ratify the agreement, but there was more or less unity in the Verkhovna Rada, Ukrainian parliament, sorting them out. Public opinion across the country was a majority in favour of joining the EU, albeit not an overwhelming majority. There were those who supported an alignment with the customs union of Russia, Belarus and Kazakhstan, and a minority who preferred non-alignment. However, in August 2013, Russia changed its own custom rules in order to stop goods from Ukraine. Ukrainian politicians saw this as the start of a trade war to prevent them from having an association agreement with the EU. The blockade had the desired effect. Industrial production significantly dropped by around 5% each month, enough for the government to put its EU plans on hold. The postponement of the association agreement negotiations led to protests across the country, which became a full-scale revolution and led to the fall of the government. It was in the aftermath of democratic presidential elections that Russia chose to invade Crimea, then a part of Ukraine. Russia gave various excuses to justify the annexation, but the truth was that Crimea was not always a part of Russia. It became a part of the Russian Empire after a battle with the Ottoman Empire in 1783, and then it was transferred to Ukraine in 1954 as part of a deal to find a successor to Stalin. So in 2013, Crimea was a legal and legitimate part of Ukraine. On top of that, it was also believed that Russia is actively backing a separatist movement in Donetsk and Luhansk in the eastern part of Ukraine. This movement is not wholly made up of Ukrainian citizens. In a news report in August 2014, the BBC reported that there were 3,000 to 4,000 volunteers in the movement, including current and retired Russian army servicemen. Now it is faced with the prospect of over 100,000 Russian troops on its border who could invade Ukraine at any time. So does Ukraine have something to fear from Russia? I would say yes, it does. So is there a good reason for Ukraine to want to join NATO? I would say yes. Now, NATO obviously wants to make sure that Russia doesn't invade those NATO countries that were within Russia's former sphere of influence. But the only way it can do that is by making sure that Russia does not invade Ukraine and think that Russia can get away with invading Ukraine. Here's the problem. Russia has already invaded Ukraine. At the time, in 2014, everyone hid behind the fact that Ukraine was not a NATO member, so there was no obligation to go to its defence. Instead, it focused on building up its own troops on the border between its own member states and Russia. With Ukraine's consent, we should have gone into Ukraine in 2014 to help them recapture Crimea and not let Russia think it had got away with it. How will this all turn out? It looks like we won't have to wait long to find out. But we definitely should help protect Ukraine's sovereignty. What do you think of this whole situation in Russia and Ukraine? Do you think that we should be jumping to Ukraine's defence even though it's not a member of NATO, or do you think we should just let Russia get away with what they're doing? Leave a comment below, and if you want to see my new future videos, please subscribe.